I knew the mood in that Seattle boardroom had shifted the moment the glass door swung open. In walked a man with a booming laugh, the sharp bite of drugstore cologne, and a handshake that lingered just long enough to feel like a warning. "Ethan Cole," he said, like the name alone should mean something to M. In my 22 years at Rainier Dynamics, I'd seen plenty of puffed-up change agents breeze in, most gone within a year. But Ethan's smirk was different, the kind that said he already knew whose chair he planned to take. I'd joined the company back in 2000 at age 24, fresh out of college, starting as a logistics coordinator. Long nights, impossible deadlines, and fixing other people's mistakes had built my reputation. Not flashy, not pole. The board knew me. The veterans respected me. Even the fresh hires learned quickly if you wanted something due. So when Ethan started tossing around phrases like fresh blood and new energy, I heard the translation loud and clear. "You're old news." Funny thing, 97% of people who hear stories like this never hit subscribe. One tap and you're part of the crew. It means the world to the folks who keep these stories alive. Anyway, Ethan's self-appointed savior of a company that hadn't asked for saving came from some flashy Portland firm. His so-called vision. From what I'd heard, it mostly involved torching relationships and then billing people for the ashes. Within his first week, he called a big strategy session. The innovations he pitched were nothing more than recycled memos from projects I'd completed 6 years earlier, down to the same bullet points. No acknowledgement, of course. I sat there flipping through his glossy, full-color handout, wondering how long it would take before the shine wore off, and he realized these walls weren't as easy to knock down as he thought. Meanwhile, the atmosphere shifted. The camaraderie I'd had with my peers began to fade. Invitations to key meetings stopped arriving in my inbox. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned to junior staff, all in the name of skill development. I knew that language. I'd once been safe from it. This time, I was the target. And I didn't yet realize the real fight hadn't even begun. This time, I was the target. Ethan would slip in little digs during calls. "We'll get someone with a more modern approach on this," or "let's not get stuck in the old ways." Always with that polite smile, just enough plausible deniability to make HR roll their eyes if I complained. Still, I kept my work spotless. If he wanted me gone, he'd have to climb over a wall of flawless results. But every day, that quiet unease grew. It wasn't just the changes. It was the way people looked at me now, like there was an invisible expiration date stamped on my forehead. Even people I'd mentored years ago seemed wary of being seen too close to me in the break room. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out a filing cabinet I'd been meaning to tackle since before Ethan arrived, I found it a leather binder, worn and heavy, the spine creased from decades of sitting untouched. The initials embossed on the cover made me stop cold. My father's. He'd been part of Rainier Dynamics before it was even called that, selling part of it during a merger back in the early 80s before I was out of high school. I sat down the office suddenly too quiet and opened it. Inside were contract stock agreements and handwritten notes in my father's neat block letters. It smelled faintly of dust and old paper, like an attic hiding something no one had touched in years. I didn't know what I was looking for, but certain pages were tucked behind others, certain lines faintly highlighted. I closed it after a few minutes, unsettled. My father never kept anything without a reason. If he'd left this here, maybe it wasn't just sentiment. Maybe it was a warning. I didn't know it yet, but that binder was the first domino. Everything that came next, the smirk, the termination, the silence in the boardroom would start from the moment my fingers touched that cracked leather cover. The first blow landed quietly. A major client I'd brought in 8 years ago met without me. I only knew because I passed the conference room and saw Ethan pitching to them with 2 junior analysts. My name never appeared in the meeting summary. The next week, a project I'd led for months was reassigned to a kid fresh out of grad school. The official reason: it's a great growth opportunity for him. We think it's a great opportunity for him to grow into leadership. That was the official line. Unofficially, Ethan didn't want me anywhere near a win that big. It's a classic move, pull someone out halfway, so the credit lands on whoever's holding the baton at the finish line. I bit my tongue and kept showing up. That's the thing about professionalism, you keep your face calm even when your stomach's in knots, and your blood pressure could blow a gasket. But the sting wasn't just the meetings or the reassignments. It was the sideways glances from people I'd trusted for years. The careful, almost apologetic tone when they asked how I was doing. The way conversations shifted the moment I walked into the break room, as if being too friendly with me might put them in Ethan's crosshairs next. Then came the meeting that sealed it for me. We were in the main conference room tackling a supply chain issue that had dragged on for months. I had the solution simple, just a matter of adjusting order timing to avoid bottlenecks. I got 30 seconds into explaining before Ethan cut me off with a chuckle. Yeah, that's one of those old school approaches. We've moved past that kind of thinking. He glanced at the junior staff like we were sharing a private joke, painting me as some relic from the typewriter and rotary phone era. A couple of them laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was safer to laugh when the boss did. I smiled, nodded, even made a little fair enough gesture, but inside, something twisted. It wasn't just humiliation. It was the knowledge this wasn't going to stop. I'd seen this pattern before, the slow removal of responsibilities, the quiet rewrite of history, the erasure from the company's living memory. If you've been with me through this fight, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter, because what comes next will make today look like the calm before the storm. That night, long after everyone had gone home, I stayed late under the guise of catching up. In truth, I was sorting my office, making sure anything important would leave with me if things went south. That's when I opened the bottom drawer of the old file cabinet, one I hadn't touched in years, and found it again. The leather binder. Heavy, cracked along the spine, smelling faintly of dust and ink. I'd skimmed it weeks earlier but never dug in. Now, with only the vending machine's hum in the background, I set it on my desk. The first page was a letter from my father to the original board, typed formal and unshakably firm. Behind it, thick contracts, merger clauses, stock agreements, all from the early 1980s. My father's handwriting appeared throughout the binder, underlining certain words, circling phrases in red ink. Then I saw it, half a page highlighted so faintly the yellow was almost gone. The legal language was dense, the kind that makes your eyes glaze over, but a few words jumped out. Termination without cause, reversion, controlling interest. I didn't fully grasp it yet, but the weight hit me square in the chest. My father had been a stubborn man, careful, methodical. He didn't leave things to chance. If he'd printed, highlighted, and kept this in my office for decades, it meant something. I sat there long after the cleaning crew passed through, flipping pages under the desk lamp while the clock's tick grew louder. By the time I slid the binder into my bag, one thing was certain: Ethan thought he was closing my story, but something in these pages hinted he was setting up my next move. For weeks, I told myself to ride it out. 22 years in, I was close enough to retirement that maybe I could grit my teeth and wait for the storm to pass. I'd seen bad managers before they burned bright, flamed out, and left behind a crater for someone else to fix. Ethan would be no different, I told myself. Some friends, former colleagues now at other companies, weren't buying it. Over drinks one Friday night, one leaned in and said, "You need a lawyer. This guy isn't just sidelining you, he's building a paper trail to fire you." I waved it off. I've been here longer than he's been in the industry. I'll outlast him. Saying it out loud made me feel in control, but deep down, I could feel the walls closing in. Back at the office, Ethan's campaign accelerated. It wasn't enough to strip me from projects, now he was planting seeds. In a staff meeting about a product launch, he said we've had issues with people hoarding responsibilities, slowing us down. He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew. The word hoarding stuck in my mind like a splinter. In that single sentence, he painted me as selfish, outdated, and in the way. I stayed silent, knowing the more defensive you sound, the guiltier you look. But silence didn't save me. The next week, I overheard two mid-level managers whispering about a strategic reorg targeting the veterans. And in this company, veterans meant one thing: people whose loyalty now carried a price tag. I told myself if I stayed useful enough, visible enough, they'd see I was worth keeping, that maybe Ethan would turn his attention elsewhere. It was denial, disguised as pragmatism. Every time I reached for the binder at home thinking I should dig into those contracts, I stopped. That was for people who'd given up, and I wasn't ready to admit I was one of them. Meanwhile, the small humiliations kept piling up. Ethan started CCing junior staff on emails meant for me as if I needed oversight. He'd forget to include me on meeting invites, then act surprised when I wasn't there. During an all-hands call, he spoke about modernizing leadership culture and mentioned phasing out legacy thinking. My phone buzzed with texts from old colleagues. "He's talking about you." Each time I swallowed the hit and kept going, telling myself it was temporary. But the balance had shifted. This wasn't a personality clash, it was about clearing the path for Ethan's vision. People like me weren't in it. Walking the halls, I felt eyes on me, not with respect, but calculation. Who's next? How long before her name's off the door? The same people who once stopped by for advice now barely lingered in my doorway. That old binder sat on my desk at home, its leather growing more worn each time I pushed it aside. I wasn't ready yet. Not because it didn't matter, but because once I opened it, there'd be no pretending. It would mean admitting that this place I'd given my youth to wasn't something I could quietly hold on to anymore. And for a woman who'd built her career on outlasting storms, that was a truth I wasn't ready to face. It happened on a Tuesday morning, ordinary, forgettable. I was halfway through an email when my phone rang. The caller ID read, "HR. You come down to conference room B now." No explanation, just the flat tone of someone who's read the same script too many times. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. Ethan was there, leaning back like he'd just won a prize. Next to him, the HR rep clutched a legal pad. "Have a seat," Ethan said smoothly. After a pause just long enough to sharpen the air, he smiled wider. "You should be thanking us." Then he slid a neat stack of papers across the table. "Your termination package." The arrogance was in his posture, the way he kept glancing at the clock, like he had somewhere more important to be. Ethan had been waiting for this moment since the day he walked in, and now he had it. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I took the pen signed where they told me to sign and slid the papers back across the table. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. Ethan blinked once like he'd expected me to break. Back in my office, I closed the door and began packing photos, a few books, the framed thank you card from a project team years ago, and the binder. That heavy, cracked leather binder had been sitting in the corner of my bookshelf for years, like it had been waiting for this exact day. I slipped it into my bag without a second thought. Leaving felt strange, not like an ending, but like stepping into the first page of something I didn't fully understand yet. The elevator ride down was silent. The lobby too bright, almost sterile. No one looked at me. No one said goodbye. It was as if I'd already been erased. At home that night, I set the box from my office on the kitchen table and pulled out the binder. I didn't bother with dinner. I poured a drink, sat down, and opened it to the section where my father's handwriting clustered in the margins. That's when I saw it, half a page buried deep in the original merger agreement. The language was dry and dense, but there it was. Upon termination without cause of my full name, 51% of company stock shall revert to the family trust. I read it twice. Then again. My pulse quickened. My father had negotiated this decades ago, before Ethan, before the current CEO, before half the people in that building had graduated high school. It had been sitting in black and white all these years, waiting for someone arrogant enough to trigger it. Rage settled into something colder. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I scrolled through my phone until I found a number I hadn't dialed in over a decade: Arthur Whitman, my father's old corporate lawyer. When he answered on the second ring, his voice was as sharp as ever. "Arthur, it's me. We need to talk. About the old merger." There was a pause, then a faint chuckle. "I was wondering when you'd call." We met that afternoon at a small diner halfway between my place in Seattle and his cabin up north. Arthur Whitman walked in wearing a tweed jacket that probably hadn't been in style since the Reagan years, but he carried himself like a man who'd never cared about trends. Before the waitress even brought coffee, I slid the binder across the table. Arthur pulled out a pair of half-moon reading glasses flipped to the highlighted section and gave me the slow, knowing grin lawyers wear when they're about to land a blow. "I remember this clause. Your father fought tooth and nail for it, nearly tanked the deal over these words right here." He tapped the page "Termination without cause triggers reversion of controlling interest 51% directly to the family trust. Not you personally," he added, "but the trust. And that still stands." My voice felt too loud in the quiet diner. "It stands," Arthur said simply. "They'd have to prove cause, and from what you've told me, they didn't even try. They thought you'd go quietly. That was their mistake. 51% wasn't just influence, it was control. Board seats. The power to hire and fire at will. The ability to wipe the smug look off Ethan's face in seconds." Arthur's smile faded. "You need to understand this will be a bombshell. When we drop it, they'll fight like cornered animals. They'll dig into your past, your finances, even try to paint you as incompetent just to save face. And the CEO will bring in lawyers who bill more in an hour than most people make in a month." I nodded slowly. Hope was creeping in, but so was reality. This wouldn't be a clean strike. It would be messy, public, and personal. Arthur closed the binder, slid it back to me, and lowered his voice. "The good news. This clause was buried so deep, I'd bet no one in current leadership has ever seen it. It's been collecting dust in an archive box for decades. That means we have the element of surprise. And in corporate law, surprise is worth more than gold." We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the first steps. Arthur would retrieve the original signed copies from his records. The game had officially begun. Arthur kept everything a habit my father had alternately mocked and admired. I'd stay quiet, let the company believe I was licking my wounds while he prepared the legal notice. Timing was everything. We needed them vulnerable, distracted, preferably scrambling over some unrelated problem. As we shook hands in the diner parking lot, Arthur gave me one last piece of advice. "They took your job thinking that was the end of the story. Don't let them realize it's only the beginning until it's too late." Driving home with the binder on the passenger seat, I felt something I hadn't since Ethan's first week in the building control. Not total control, but the shape of it waiting. For the first time since I'd walked out of HR, I allowed myself to imagine sitting on the other side of the table with the pen in my hand. 2 days later, the company posted the announcement. Short, clinical, cold, exactly the kind of PR sanitized execution Ethan would be proud of. After 22 years of service, my name has decided to part ways with Rainier Dynamics to pursue other opportunities. We thank her for her contributions, but in the evolving landscape of our industry, fresh perspectives are essential for continued growth. If you've read one of these, you know the translation: "We pushed her out and want you to believe she couldn't keep up." The kicker was the last line. "We wish her the best of luck in her future endeavors." Nothing says dead weight like that tired phrase. They let the whispers do the rest, performance issues outdated, out of touch. Ethan didn't need to plant the rumors. The statement watered them for him. A few old colleagues reached out with awkward messages, half sympathy, half curiosity. I gave them nothing. I stayed silent, no press, no social media, not even the quiet conversations swirling through the industry. The more they believed I was gone, the deeper the trap would be when Arthur and I dropped the truth. While their version spread, I worked in silence. Every morning, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the binder taking notes. I pulled old annual reports, SEC filings, and archived shareholder lists, anything to confirm the current ownership structure and prove how devastating a 51% reversion would be. One detail stood out: two major clients had quietly ended contracts last quarter. It hadn't been disclosed. The losses were big enough to rattle investors. I didn't need to leak it just to know exactly where the cracks were forming. Arthur worked quietly in the background, slipping through legal channels like a ghost. He had the original signed documents scanned, certified, and ready, and was drafting the official notice of reversion. His one instruction to me: keep your head down, don't poke the bear until we're ready. So I played the part: the quietly discarded veteran, the woman nursing her wounds in private. I took calls from recruiters, pretended to be exploring options, and kept my tone light whenever Rainier dynamics came up. Meanwhile, I was building a folder on my desk labeled boardroom ammo. Then, one Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend still inside emergency board meeting next Tuesday. Topic: financial stability. I leaned back, letting the words sink in. Financial stability, corporate code for panic. If they were pulling the board together without notice, something had rattled them. Maybe a client walking, maybe an investor stirring the pot. Either way, it was exactly the moment Arthur had told me to wait for. I pictured Ethan in that room, convinced he'd buried me under a narrative of obsolescence, completely unaware the fuse was already burning toward him. The hurt was gone. The humiliation was gone. What remained was the cold focus of someone who knows the exact hour her enemies will realize they've made a career-ending mistake. The morning of the meeting felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, toes over the drop, waiting for the wind to decide which way you'll fall. I wasn't part of the company anymore. My badge dead, my email long locked. But Arthur had every legal right to represent the family trust. That was the loophole, the quiet back door my father had left decades ago. We'd agreed I wouldn't walk in yet. Let the documents speak first. Let the shock hit before they saw my face. So I waited in the hallway outside the boardroom, pacing slow, measured steps over carpet that muffled everything but my heartbeat. Through the closed doors, I caught the low thrum of voices, board members talking over one another, the CFO's sharp interjections, the clipped caution of in-house counsel. Crisis mode. And they didn't know the real bomb was still coming. Then the hinges creaked. The door opened. Silence. Arthur didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. Arthur walked in without hesitation, his presence cutting through the room like a cold draft in the middle of their warm panic. "Gentlemen," he said, voice carrying that perfect blend of courtroom confidence and calm. He didn't wait for permission. He set his leather briefcase on the table, flipped the clasps, and removed the original merger agreement, yellowed edges, crisp signatures, and the faint glow of a decades-old highlight. No speech, no preamble. He placed the document in the center of the table, adjusted it toward the CEO, and stepped back. From my place in the hallway, I couldn't see, but I could imagine it: the CEO flipping through the first page, then the second, skimming with that dismissive speed people use when they assume nothing important is coming. Then, silence. Even through the closed door, I felt it. The pause was heavy, almost physical, the kind that drops into a room when someone realizes they've stepped into something they can't undo. I pictured the exact moment his eyes landed on the claws, my father's claws, the trigger they'd pulled, without knowing it. Arthur spoke then, low and deliberate, likely making it impossible for anyone to claim ignorance later. My pulse hammered. I paced slowly past the door, tempted to walk in right then, but timing mattered. I wanted them to sit with it, to feel the weight of that 51% before they saw me. A minute later, the CEO's voice came, not the confident tone from investor calls, but thin, uncertain. "Is this verified?" Arthur's reply cut clean through the air, signed, sealed, and enforceable. Silence returned, deeper this time. Somewhere in it, I knew the balance of power had shifted. They didn't know my next move, whether I'd come for their jobs, their deals, or their entire hold on the company, but I knew. Arthur let the tension build. I heard the scrape of his chair, the shuffle of paper. His voice was steady, formal. For the record, I will now read the relevant clause from the original merger agreement dated March 14, 1983. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the HVAC. And then my full name middle included, upon termination without cause. 51% of company stock shall revert to the family trust. The silence that followed didn't feel like contemplation. It felt like impact. Somewhere in that stillness, I heard the clatter of a pen hitting the tabletop, quick and sharp, like someone's grip had gone slack. I pictured the board members glancing at each other, the math already clicking into place. 51% wasn't influence. It wasn't just a vote. It was ownership, control. In that moment, Rainier Dynamics was no longer theirs. It was mine. Arthur let the silence stretch before adding, "A triggering event occurred last week when my client was terminated without cause. This transfer is immediate and binding under corporate law and the company's own charter." The murmurs started low, urgent, overlapping. I could see it in my mind, the CFO leaning toward the CEO, whispering fast, the head of legal rifling through his notes, searching for a loophole that didn't exist, one of the outside directors texting under the table. But the CEO, his pride ran too deep to flinch, would be sitting perfectly still, staring at the page, processing the fact that the woman Ethan had pushed out the door now had the power to fire him. Arthur didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every second they sat there staring at that language, the truth was settling into their bones. I felt it in my chest, a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. For weeks I'd imagined this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud, formalized into the record, was something else entirely. Somewhere in that room, someone was already planning an exit strategy. Someone else was thinking about an emergency session, forgetting those days were over. And I stood outside, the weight shifting fully into my hands. They understood. I was no longer the veteran they'd discarded. I was the controlling shareholder. The woman they'd underestimated had just stepped legally and permanently to the very top of their world. Arthur opened the boardroom door, and the silence rolled out like a wave. Every pair of eyes turned to me, some wide with shock, others narrowed with calculation, all realizing the story they'd told themselves for a week was dead. Ethan sat 2 chairs from the end. The smirk from the day he fired me was gone, replaced by a thin, bloodless line. Shoulders hunched, hands clasped so tight I could see the tendons from across the room. I didn't slow. I walked straight to the head of the table, the CEO's seat, and pulled the chair back. The chair's low scrape across the floor felt like a starting gun. I sat, adjusted my blazer, and let the silence breathe. "Let's begin," I said evenly. Arthur slid a folder in front of me. The top page was marked in bright yellow. I signed and pushed it to the center. "As controlling shareholder, my first order of business is the immediate termination of Ethan Cole's contract." Ethan flinched. His mouth opened, then shut, searching the room for rescue. None came. Legal counsel kept his gaze down. An outside director almost smirked. "HR will escort you from the building," I added. "Your belongings will be sent to you." He left without a word, each step heavier than the last. The air felt cleaner. I didn't pause. Another stack of papers slid to the CEO. "This is your termination package, effective immediately." His lips parted in protest, but I tapped the folder once. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was acceptance. They understood the shift was final. The CEO didn't reach for the papers. He didn't need to. The man who once ran Rainier Dynamics now knew exactly what it meant to be powerless. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. The power wasn't in theatrics, it was in the knowledge I could do it again to any of them whenever I chose. Only the steady hum of the air system filled the room, a company's heartbeat now answering to me. Thanks for watching, you Cubicle Warriors. Hit subscribe unless you're my old boss.